Hi and welcome to the week 10 extra exercises walkthrough video. In this video, we're going to be having a look at all of the extra exercises for this week, including the random number generator, the addition calculator, and the quadratic plotter. As we've talked about in lectures, there's two ways to create apps in Matlab. The first method is to do it programmatically from scratch. The second method is to do it with AppDesigner. So for this first exercise, the random number generator, we're going to do it both ways so that you can sort of see the process for both. However, I would recommend AppDesigner. It's a very nice way to get something up and running quite quickly, and it still allows you a lot of flexibility in terms of actually programming the functionality. So we'll do the programmatic approach first, and then we'll dive into AppDesigner from there. So let's head over to Matlab, and we'll kick off by creating a new file, and we'll make it a function called random number generator. So the very first thing we need to do is create the UI figure that we'll be working on. So we want UI figure, we'll give it a name. So RNG, random number generator figure equals UI figure. And then we're also going to want a label and some buttons. So we'll start off with the label. So create the label, and we'll call it RNG label equals UI label. And we want to put that on the RNG figure. So at the moment, this might actually be a good point to just save it. So I'll save it, I'll run it, and we can see that we have this UI figure that has a single label on it. So we're also eventually going to want a button, so it wouldn't hurt to create the button and just check that we have them both appearing where we want them to be appearing. So RNG figure. So we've created, oops, sorry, that was supposed to be UI button there, and passing it again to the, well, passing it the figure that it needs to be on. Oops, so it looks like they've covered each other up, but we have only opened up one window, so that suggests that they've both gone to the place that we want them to. So now let's work on actually making these elements pretty. So for our label, we're going to want to increase the font size, change the position around, just generally make it stand out a little bit better. So let's start with our position. So RNG label dot position. And this is a 4-part array. So it has the starting X position, the starting Y position of the bottom left corner, and then the length and the height. So at a guess, I'm going to say we want to be about 100, 150 in, probably quite high. So let's say 300. And we're going to want it to be fairly wide because we do have a reasonably sized label to put down. So we'll do that. And then we'll actually make that label text. So the text property allows you to set what the label will say. So the text is going to say random number button. And if I run this at this point, we should see that it's been moved up and it says random number button. So that's good. Now that font's still not overly readable or nice, so we're going to go ahead and increase the font size as a start, and we'll see how it looks. So let's set it to 26 as a starting point and run it again. That looks pretty good, but it's sort of not quite centered and it's still could go a little higher up. So I might just change this down to 125 or so, and maybe set this height here to 350. And if we run that again, not quite centered. You can do some more intelligent, like setting of the position with respect to the size of the window, but I'm not going to dive into that because I think it's honestly just easier to do it with AppDesigner. But for now, let's just say that's close enough to centered and call it a day. So that's good. I'm going to leave the label there. We don't really need to do anything too fancy with it. And now I'm going to move on to the button. So our button, we're going to want in a fairly similar position. So let's set it at the same X position. Let's set it at a slightly lower height of 300. Let's set the width to be 500 and the height to be 40 as well. And we'll just run that and we'll see how that button looks. So I obviously way overestimated the width required for that, so I can probably drop both of those down to 300. And yeah, that's, again, it's still not quite in the middle, but that looks pretty good. So we could probably reduce that a notch further. Actually, I think what we could do instead is rng-label.horizontal alignment is a property, if I remember correctly, and change that to center. Yep, that worked. Perfect. So that's not centering it within the whole window, that's just centering it within the actual positional space that I've defined here. Okay, so we have a lot of open windows. Let's close some of those down. And we have a button and a label. So the next thing we actually are going to need to do is get the button to do something. So we can set up a callback function for that purpose. So buttons have a built-in callback function called button pressed function from memory. If, like me, you can't quite remember, you can go over to the command window and just type get UI button. And that'll create a little dummy button, but it'll also tell you the properties that are available. So button pushed function, sorry, not button pressed. So button pushed function. So then what we can do from there is actually create a function. So we use the handle notation and we say generate, let's say we're going to call the function generate random number. Then we actually need to create that function. So function generate random number. And callback functions have to take a app and an event. So you can just put those in as little squiggly lines to say that we're not really interested in them in this particular instance. So with those in place, we can then go about writing the actual functionality that we're looking for. So what we want it to do is we want it to generate a random number and display it on that button. So we'll go RNG button. Actually, we'll generate a random number first. So random number, and the instructions, I believe, said from 1 to 100. So we want it to be a random integer with a maximum of 100. And then we want to display that. So RNG button dot text, and we'll create a little text array that says random number and then provides that random number that we've just generated. And actually, I just remembered too, we probably want some sort of meaningful text at the start because at the moment it just says button. So we can probably set up in our button itself a introductory text message. So hello, please press me. So now when we press him, we should get a random number that is somewhere between 0 and 100. And we are, so that's good. Now there was a little extension task listed in terms of seeing whether you can get the background color to change every time you press the button. So the way that we can do that is using the background color functionality. So RNG button has a property called background color, color spelt the American way with an OR instead of an OOU, or UR I should say. And that is in RGB format, so you just specify a triplet of colors. Maybe you want a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, and no green. So let's say no green and a little bit of blue. And let's run that to see what it looks like. It's not bad. Maybe make it a bit brighter if we can. Now I've just opened up a whole lot of windows. Yep, that'll do the trick. So we now have a default color, but we want to change that color every time the button's pressed. Currently it doesn't change, it just does the random number. So what we can do is we can, inside our button press callback, type in random button, RNG button dot button background color, I should say. And we can just create the array directly. So we can use the rand function. If you don't remember, you can go over to the help documentation again, and rand by default returns a value between 0 and 1, which is the same as RGB color space. It's between 0 and 1 from Matlab's perspective. So we can just go rand, 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 and that's going to give us 3 random numbers between 0 and 1 to create our RGB values. So running that now, we get a color change in line with our number change. So that's the creation of a simple random number generator using the programmatic approach. Now we'll move on to our AppDesigner approach. So in our AppDesigner approach, we first need to launch AppDesigner. So head on back to the command window and just type in AppDesigner. That'll create a new window, and within that new window, you can select a blank app and we can get designing. So you can adjust this canvas size however you want, and then you can pop in your label for the heading. And this is where things are much easier because as you can see, it's very easy to center that. I can also use the inspector panel on the right to set the alignment and the font size very, very quickly and easily. And I can also change the label value itself quite quickly. You can also do that by double clicking and typing there. So that's the label done in a lot less time than we did it before, and the button's much the same. So with our button, we can find it somewhere, right at the top, naturally, and we can pop it in and make it the size that we want it. And again, we can do things like we can set a default color. So we could make the initial background color some sort of nice purpley color, which is a lot easier to do now that we actually have this sort of color pop-up panel rather than having to try and guess at RGB codes ourselves. And there we have it, a nice kind of lilac-y color. We can change the label on the button. So, hello, please press me for a random number. And that's done too. And that pretty much just leaves the callback function, which we can add by going to the callbacks tab next to the inspector button we were in before, and actually coming up with a name for our button push function. So I think before we just called it random number or generate random number. That'll do here again. And then once we've got the name we want, all you have to do is press enter, and it will pop over into the code view panel where it's got all of the automatically generated code from the kind of graphical layout we did, as well as the section we're able to edit in white. So this is a template for that particular button. I've just realized the button has quite a ridiculous name. Hello, please press me for a random number button. So we can probably drop that down to RNG button like we had before. So now we're just going to put in the same functionality that we had before. So we'll start off with updating. We're going to get a random number and we're going to use that to update the button. So random number equals randi 100 gives us a random integer between 1 and 100. And then from there, we can actually create the button text. So now our object is named app.rng button. So there are some names automatically generated, and usually they're fairly helpful. Here I've actually changed it to be app.rng button because before it had a pretty long name. So our object is app.rng button. And our property is the text that we're looking to change at this stage. And again, we're going to say random number. And we're going to actually include that random number. So at this point, we'll run it, and we will save that as just maybe RNG button. Okay, it won't let you name something that's the same as the component. That's good to know. We'll call it random number generator then. And there we have it. So we can see our little graphical display, and when we press it, it gives us the random number. So now we can go ahead and implement our extension task again of actually changing the background color of that button randomly as we go. And we can do that by just accessing the background color property like we did before. So again, the name of our object is app.rng button. You can get that from the sidebar with the component browser is. And our property is background color. And you can see here in AppDesigner, it gives you little hints. So things it thinks you might be interested in. So even if you aren't completely sure what a particular property is called, you can just start typing. The other good thing about it is that you can just navigate back to design view and select a component and see all of the things that are available in the right-hand side there. So these titles as they appear are the names of the properties. Now we want this background to be random. So again, we're just going to call, rand, which gives us that number between 0 and 1 for our RGB color space. And when I run this, we will get a nice color change happening in the background as our random number changes as well. So that's our random number button app, 2 different ways. And I do recommend using AppDesigner. While programmatic gives you more control, it also does give you more room to make mistakes. AppDesigner makes it a lot quicker to get the app developed, and you could always convert it then to your programmatic approach if you did need that higher level of control. So I highly recommend AppDesigner, at least for initial app development. So moving on to the second task now, we're going to look at building this little addition calculator. So it's just a simple little miniature calculator that has 3 edit boxes with the right one locked, so that one can't actually be edited. It's just designed like that for formatting purposes. These 2 can be edited, and the user would enter some actual numbers in there, and then they would press the calculate button to get a result displayed in the rightmost box. Now you could alternatively do it so that anytime these numbers were changed in the left-hand side here, that it would automatically update. However, given that we've been working with buttons so far, I thought it would be good to do one more exercise with the button. However, if you want to then go back and play with the edit field updating, then please feel free. So we'll go over to AppDesigner and we will create a new app. Again, we're just going to use the blank app template, and I'm going to shrink the canvas down because we don't really need that much space here. Then I'm going to select the canvas and I'm going to give it a different sort of background color. Maybe a nice shade of blue would be good. Yeah, that bluey green is quite nice. So the main things we're going to need here are the edit fields. We'll also need some labels for the plus and equals, and we'll need a calculate button as well, which we'll do with the push button. So we'll start with the edit field. Now, if you have a look in the component library, there's actually 2 options for edit fields. There's edit field numeric and there's edit field text. Both of them allow the user to input some sort of data. However, the numeric one prevents the user from entering anything other than numbers. So in this case, that's helpful because it does the error handling for us. We don't have to check that the user has input a number before doing the addition. We can just immediately proceed with calculating the result. So if we pop one of these in, I'll show you how it works. So I'm going to pop that in and I'm going to make the dimensions of this square. So let's go to the position property and maybe make it 45 by 45. And I'm just going to run this now. So we'll call it calculator or addition calculator. And we'll run it. And we can see here that we've just got, the simple edit box. Nothing's really designed yet, but we've just got this simple box. If I try to type in numbers, that's all good. Negative numbers are fine. But the second I try to type in a letter or leave it blank, then we get this pop-up error saying the value must be numeric. So that's good because it means that we don't have to handle that problem ourselves. The AppDesigner field is doing it for us. And if we tried to then, enter on that or leave that field, it would just default back to the previous value, which was 0. So that's handy to use, and we'll use it for the purpose of creating this calculator. So I'm going to just copy this field 3 times over. That way it's all the same size with minimal effort. And the other interesting thing about AppDesigner versus the previous tools that it's replacing is that you can actually bulk edit elements. So there I just held down the control key and I selected multiple. You could also do it by selecting multiple over in the component browser. Again, just holding the control key as you click each component. And now that I've selected them all, I can change all of their font sizes at once. So let's make them all 26. Let's make them all centered. You could do any other formatting that you want there as well. If you wanted the addition to be limited within a particular range of numbers, you could change the limits here. So at the moment, it will allow the user to enter anything from negative infinity through to positive infinity. If you wanted to change that to say 1 to 10 or whatever, you could do that there. I'm just going to leave it though. The value property is the value currently in the box. So if I change that to 1, it would update that there. But I'll leave it at 0 because that's a fairly reasonable default value. So that's the editable boxes. One more thing to do actually with the rightmost one is to change its editability. So under the interactivity tab in the property inspector, there's this property of editable. So if it's checked on, it means that the user can edit it just like you would expect for a standard edit field. But if you want to deactivate that editing functionality, you can uncheck it. So my logic here is just that it looks a little bit more consistent with the other boxes. It's nice and easy to get that formatting looking the same as opposed to doing something like putting in a label with a background or something like that. So it's just a nice, easy way to get a consistent aesthetic, I guess. So now I'm going to add in some labels for the plus and minus. So I'm going to do them as two separate labels. I'll make the font size about the same as what I did for the edit field. So 26, I think was right. And just position those where you want them. Again, you can copy and paste a label and that will transfer any of the changes that you've made so far. So we'll keep the font size the same for the plus and the equals in this case. And then the last thing is our button. So our button, we can hop over here and update the text there to calculate. And that's all we really need to do. You can play around with other visual elements, but this is all we need to make it work. So for the calculate button then, we want to again create a callback for that one. So we click on the button, we navigate over to the callbacks tab on the right hand side, and then we give the button pushed function a name. So in this case, we want to maybe calculate result. That's probably a reasonable name for the function. Press enter on your keyboard or click on the arrow and it will launch into the automatically generated code. So again, just like before, you can see all the auto-generated code for each of the elements that we placed graphically. And we also can see with the white background here, a section that we're able to edit. So this here is where we're going to calculate the result. One more thing I might actually do with some of these fields is give them more meaningful names. So at the moment, you can see in the right-hand side, we've got edit field 2, edit field 3. That doesn't really mean much to anyone. So perhaps we could rename this one something like num1, as in number 1, to indicate that that's the first number involved with the equation. And then the second one we could call num2, and the result field we could just call maybe result num or something similar to that. The label names being poor doesn't really matter because we're not really going to be using those labels. We're not going to be changing those labels rather, so that's fine. Hop back over into code view and now we can actually go about calculating the result and displaying it in that rightmost box that we've grayed out. So we want to access the value property. Remember I mentioned that the value of this was something we could change here or set, we can make it 1, we could set it back to 0. So that value property, in other words, is the number contained within that box. So if we wanted to get the value from num1, we would go app.num1, which is again the name of the object as seen on the right, dot value, which is the particular property that we're interested in. And because this is an edit field numeric, it will be by default a number. If you had used the edit field text, then it would be a string by default. So val2 then is going to be app.num2, so that's the num2 option from the right-hand side. The num2 object from the right-hand side is what I'm trying to say. And then the property will again be value. And then what we want to do is actually change the value of the app result num. So app.resultNum object, and we want to change its value to the sum of val1 and val2. And that's all there is to it. So you grab the two numbers and you set the new number in the result panel. Run that and we can update these numbers. So let's say 1 and 2, calculate that, you get an expected value, maybe make that one a negative, result still checks out, and then so on and so forth. So we now have a functional little calculator that just does addition. The other little thing you can do that I've just remembered, so up the top of this little window, you can see that it just says Matlab app. If you want to give your program a little descriptive name at the top there, you can actually do that by going back over into the component browser and clicking on the app.ui figure. Scroll down from there and there's a tab called identifiers, and within that there's a name property. If you change the name property to say calculator, maybe mini calculator, and then run it again, you can actually see that the title of the overall window now is that mini calculator name that we've just assigned it. So that's just a nice little finishing touch to make the app a little bit more sophisticated and, I guess, comparable to real software that you use every day. So that's task 2 complete, which brings us over to the third and final exercise, which is this quadratic plotter. So the concept here is that there's 3 editable fields, so edit fields again, which we can use the numeric type again. And it's just implementing the standard ax squared plus bx plus c equation for quadratics and plotting it on a UI axis. Now, you could do this a few different ways. You could actually adapt the axis intelligently based on the numbers that are entered, that sort of thing. But for now, we're just going to keep it simple, and we're just going to plot it for a range of -10 to 10 on the x-axis and just see what it looks like on the y-axis. And as an extension task, we're also going to look at actually putting in a legend with the equation. So let's go over to AppDesigner again and create another new app. We'll again use a blank canvas, and we'll start to put together the things we need. So again, we will need some edit fields. I'm going to, again, just make it sort of square. So there's my position. There it is. Set that to 45 by 45. Center it and increase the font size to be a little bit more readable. Oh, I meant to type 26 pen. That's a bit too big. And we'll copy and paste that for the B and C as well. And I'll give them all slightly more meaningful names. Not super descriptive, but A-val, B-val, and C-val to indicate that they're the A, B, and C parameters of the quadratic equation. And now I'm going to use a few labels to create the middle bit. So here we're going to have x squared. And we'll again make that about the same size as we had. And we'll also put the plus in there actually. And that will sit there. And then copy and paste that and pop in the x plus, and we'll position that so that it sort of fits nicely there. When you're working with the labels, be careful not to place labels over editable fields, because if they sort of are sitting over it, you won't be able to click on the actual edit field to change its values, which is not really what you're looking for when you're making an editable field. So just be wary of that. If you put down labels and you all of a sudden can't actually access your edit fields, that could be why. So we've got those 3 edit field numeric values in there now. And the only other thing we need graphically is an axis. So that's the very first option in our container. And we'll just draw a decent sized axis there. You can get rid of the title. You can change the X and Y axes however you see fit. So now what we're going to need to do is create a callback function for each of these edit fields. So click on one of them, go to callbacks and type what you would like to call it. Maybe plot quadratic. Press enter and that will generate the automatic code. Now that links this first box to that function, but actually we want all of these boxes to trigger the same action. No matter which one we want to change, we want it to plot the quadratic. So for each of the other boxes, you also want to go to callbacks and add plot quadratic as the value changed function. And it will actually pop up as you start typing it. So now if you go back to the code view, you'll see that the value change function is now for A-val, B-val, and C-val. This code will run no matter which one you change, which is exactly what we want because any changes should be reflected in the graph. So we can now get A, so we can go app.aval, which is the object, the edit field that represents the A position and value. B equals app.bval object and the value property of that. And C equals app.cval.value, which is the value property of the cval object. And now we can set up a range of x values. Like I mentioned before, you could do this in a number of intelligent ways based on the ABC values. However, for now, I'm just going to keep it simple and set it up as -10 in steps of 0.1 to 10. Then I'm going to calculate y using the quadratic equation. So a times x to the power of 2, don't forget the element-wise notation there, plus b times x plus c. And now we can actually plot that to the axis. So by default, the axis was created with the name UI axis. You can change that if you want. And in fact, if you have multiple axes, you should change it. But given we only have one, I'm okay with keeping that name. So we'll plot the result to the axes. To do that, all we need to do is type plot, give it the axes name. So app.UI axes is the axis property in this case, and x and y. And we'll add the legend afterwards. For now, we're just going to check that this all works the way we want. So I've just saved it as quadratic plotter and launched it. So we have our 3 editable boxes. Changing those calculates the quadratic equation for the range of -10 to 10 using those ABC values and plots it on the axis below. So that is the exact behavior that we were looking for. Now we can also add the legend like we were discussing as the extension task. The way to do that is just to, again, use the same function that you normally would, the legend function. And then again, it gives you a little hint down here, so it tells you what you need to include if you don't remember. So axis would be app.UI axes again, and you want to then provide the label. So we can build a bit of a string here. So num to string a, and then we would have x squared plus num to string b, x plus num to string c. So now running this again, relaunch my program, and when I update my values now, I'll actually get that legend popping up at the top. And you could use all the same sorts of formulas, functions that you've used in the past to modify the position and appearance of that legend. So the plotting is slightly different to other functionalities of changing the GUI. Pretty much you can use most of the same functions that you've used previously. You just need to pass this axis that's the target in as an extra parameter, which we haven't necessarily done before. So that's the main difference. Other than that, you can pretty much continue as usual with the graphs. And that's it. So that's our 3 extra exercises for the GUI section. As you can see, AppDesigner makes designing these quite easy. You just drag and drop the components you need. It's very easy to position them, etc. It's a huge improvement over the previous tool, which was called Guide. Some of you may have had experience with that if you've taken the subject before or used Matlab in the past. But AppDesigner is definitely a much better user experience. So I'll leave it there. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments or by talking to me in Cairns or the lecturer in Townsville. Yeah, I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you found this video to be helpful.